Guys, this is a serious video. This is a serious question that will be answered. I will now answer the question which has plagued humanity since the dawn of time, and that is SCP-3812, a voice behind me, versus SCP-001, S. Andrew Swann's proposal, the database. First, we have to look at those two opponents which are going to battle against each other. Firstly, SCP-3812, a voice behind me. So, oftentimes referred to as the most powerful SCP and, on some occasions, the most powerful fictional being ever to have been written, SCP-3812 has certainly been a cause for debate in the power scaling community. SCP-3812 possesses many abilities, such as ontokinetic, which are reality-bending capabilities, teleportation, erasing things, beings, and even concepts from existence, immune to any forms of damage, be they physical or psychological, among many other things. However, when people are talking about SCP-3812, they most often never even mention these abilities, but often focus on one single thing. SCP-3812 ascends any and every narrative that it had previously reached, constantly spiraling upwards, with it having long surpassed its author, now being infinitely higher than every other narrative. In other terms, SCP-3812 perceives us as fiction, the same way we treat, for example, the Star Wars movies as fiction, which we can alter at will like words on a book. SCP-3812 perceives us and every other narrative as fiction, which SCP-3812 potentially can alter and rewrite at will. Fortunately, SCP-3812 suffers from many psychological illnesses and is not hostile, but that does not mean that SCP-3812 does not pose a serious threat. That is SCP-3812, a voice behind me. Now, the other side, SCP-001, S. Andrew Swann's proposal, the database. With this being one of the many SCP-001 proposals, this SCP is also known for another reason. It's the most meta SCP that has ever existed. It certainly does deserve this title. In short, S. Andrew Swann's proposal is a story in which the SCP Foundation discovers that their universe and their entire existence is simply the creation of horror authors, horror writers, with us changing their very existence at will while they have to suffer from the creations of the numerous authors. Excerpt from S. Andrew Swann's proposal, to better understand it. But we found out that there is a God, and it is SCP-001, and it's a bunch of horror writers. We are SCP-001. We are the ultimate gods of the SCP universe. The SCP Foundation can't do anything no matter how much they try, as we are real and they are fiction. Now, after you know what those two opponents can do, what they are capable of, we come to the battle. In the story of SCP-3812, he surpassed his author, now being the author of his author, and the author of the author of his author, and the author of the author of the author of his author, infinitely continuing upwards and downwards. But what if I were to tell you that this isn't the case? Now, what makes SCP-3812 so powerful is its ability to travel upwards and downwards the layers of narratives, but that whole concept of narratives is still fiction, it is not real. But what about the scene where SCP-3812 surpassed its own author? That wasn't the actual author, but only an avatar of the author, which is similar to him, but not him. The author basically wrote a story with him in there, and SCP-3812 is surpassing himself in that story, but that still isn't the real author. A good example is SCP-5500 Death of the Authors, where the SCP Foundation attempts and succeeds at initiating procedure ZK-001-Alpha and kill the authors, causing the SCP universe to slowly crumble apart as the O5 Council try to fix their mistakes. In one of SCP-5500's endings, it's a multiple choice story, like you can choose your own. It's a choose your own adventure story. A Foundation researcher makes contact with an author entity while everything is falling apart. The author explains that they didn't actually kill the real authors, but only avatars of the real authors, to put it simply. When the researcher asked, "Why did you do all of this?" the author simply replied, "Because that makes for an interesting story." There is a fixed line between reality and fiction, and SCP-3812 is not real and never will be, making us the most powerful SCP. Therefore, SCP-001 as Andrew Swann's proposal, the database wins.